We're in the end of the question series. Was it cool? Was it good?
Yeah.
Did you like it? I got to talk about your questions, and that was fun for me because sometimes the liturgical calendar, I don't think it addresses the kind of the pressing questions. They're just kind of, sometimes we can hit on them a little bit here and there, but we don't really directly take them on. Some people sit on their questions for a long time, and they don't really have a safe place to ask them or think that's appropriate to ask them. I remember when I was a teenager, just getting started off on like being new to the faith and kind of being excited about it, and I would ask my pastor specific questions that seemed logical to a new person, but I guess I wasn't allowed to ask those questions. And I would either get laughed at or just kind of written off, and I always felt like, well, I guess that was the wrong question to have. I better learn the right questions. And then they told me the right questions, and then they gave me the answers to those questions, and then all the proofs that they had to back up the answers to those questions. And I'm like, well, that's cool, but what about the other questions that are on the outside of the pre-approved ones that I'm allowed to ask? And so I like to make a little bit of space for that kind of stuff. Now today we're delving into kind of an interesting topic. It's more the afterlife kind of stuff. What happens when you die? Now that's an interesting question, isn't it? Short answer, I don't know. Good? Okay. You go home now? The short answer, I don't know. Long answers are a little bit more fun than that, but the Bible doesn't really describe it very much. A lot of the descriptions that we think are like descriptions of the afterlife, usually they're apocalyptic phrases for something else entirely. So when Jesus talks about, you'll be cast away into utter darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And we're like, oh, well that must be eternal conscious torment version of an afterlife where you're suffering forever and ever because you didn't believe the right information in your head about God. That's a lot of assumption put into that, isn't it? Like all of that assumption comes with that. But really, that's an apocalyptic prophetic phrase that he picked up from Jeremiah. And Jeremiah had no afterlife theology, really, that he talked about. And it was more of like the destruction of Jerusalem language. But we don't really use apocalyptic language anymore. So it's confusing to us, and we think it's just kind of literal. Or the book of Revelation. You go to the book of Revelation, and there's, descriptions of a lake of fire and all this other stuff. Again, that's apocalyptic writings in a prophetic tone that's not meant to be taken literal. If you take it literal, then you get like weird novels like the Left Behind series. That's just weird. And so it's not meant to be taken literal. It is a prophetic, apocalyptic language that's really hard to apply. And there's 7 different interpretations of the book of Revelation, not just one. There's 7. And in the midst of those 7, there's different branches that then branch off. And so if you have one, then when you get to this specific topic in theology, then it branches off into 3 different kinds. And so there's a lot of different ways you can take it. So saying that the Bible is very clear, the afterlife is going to look like this or experience this, is not quite. I don't think the Bible talks about the afterlife as much as we think it does. I think it talks a lot more about the present life that we have and how we are to live this life than it does the afterlife. But it does give hints at the afterlife that the church has kind of taken down different roads. So we're going to explore a lot of different ones about that. But one of the questions I've been putting off, just because it didn't seem to fit into a lot of what we were talking about, was a question that one of our Facebook persons had, and it was about the eternal nature of God. And did God exist before the Big Bang? Now that's a fun question, isn't it? So the Big Bang, if you understand the scientific term of the Big Bang, is at the beginning of all things, there was a singularity with all of the mass of the universe was inside of that small little point of infinite mass that then exploded and gave us a lot of hydrogen and helium that started to coalesce around different gravity. They started to bump together, stick together. Things with more mass have more gravity, they attract more, and then they became stars. The stars then burned through an entire cycle and exploded, and they were like fusing different elements together. It gave us more elements like iron and all of other things, and that's kind of how science says the universe was created. Now, there are specific, like, young earth creationist stances of that take the book of Genesis literal and say that's how God did it, and that therefore the earth is only about 6,000 years old, because if we look at all the genealogies in the book, and someone did that, I can't remember his name, but it was around 1200 AD. They did the math of the genealogies and said, oh, if we take all the genealogies in the Bible and go all the way back to Adam and Eve, that was 6,000 years ago. And then we have the evolution science by Darwin comes out in the 1800s, and then it became illegal to teach that in schools somewhere in southern districts, and we have the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s where a teacher was actually sued for teaching evolution in a science class, and teaching evolution in Tennessee wasn't legal until 1967. So that's a weird law fact that we just explored. So there's a lot of contention around science and faith that it's hard to talk about the two at the same time because they're very different things. So some people reject faith altogether and say it's all material, and it's all the material world, and everything's natural, and there's nothing supernatural or extra to that. It's just all natural. They're the materialist naturalists. And then you have the other side that say, no, it's, faith is the most important thing, and science is all wrong, and the Bible is the best explanation of science and history and faith and all that kind of stuff. That's fairly new theology that came about after the 1920s fundamentalist response to a lot of the scientific findings that were happening. So, does God exist before the Big Bang is a tricky topic, because now we're blending the two disciplines together. We have science that says, because of the expansion of the universe and the speed of that expansion, there must have been an explosion that happened. So they actually just put that expansion rate in reverse and said, well, to bring it all back down to a single point would have taken this long. Hence the 14 billion years that they put on the universe's age. Somewhere around there, 14 billion, which is a long time. So that's the science end of things. But then we have this book of Genesis that says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So what do we do with those two things? Now, the interesting thing about Genesis is, if you look at when God didn't step out onto nothing and then speak and then things came into existence. Because it says, in the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was already there and formless and void. If you notice that in the text in Genesis, it says the earth was formless and void. There was something there in the beginning. It didn't say that God made something that was there. So that's a really fun distinction in the book of Genesis. This old mythology kind of a talk was not about how the earth was made or how everything came to be. It was more of the who. It was a description of the who that was doing the making. And the who that's doing the making is this God named Elohim that kind of comes into this chaotic, formless void and then brings order to the chaos. That's the kind of God that they're trying to describe. They're not trying to describe, here's a scientific explanation of how everything happened. It's more of, this is the character of that God is one that likes to bring order to chaos. And then if you look at the end of the story arc of the first few chapters of Genesis, it ends with the flood of Noah. And it started with these chaotic waters, and God speaks, and land comes, and all these other things happen. And then it ends with the chaotic waters come back over and floods everything to chaos again. And it's kind of telling the story of this is what happens when human evil has no checks, no balances, and just runs amok. The chaos kind of comes back. And so it's not really a description of how things are coming to be so much as a description of the character of the God that makes things and what the God is doing. The beginning point, we don't know, because in the beginning there's a formless void that's already there, and God steps in and then starts to bring order. So this is a fun question because it starts to blend the two disciplines of science and faith together and ask a question: did God exist before the Big Bang happened? And to get into the nitty-gritty of this one, we have to ask a question: what is time? Have you ever thought of that? That's like asking a fish, what's water? It's like, I don't know. I hear it's wet. But I don't know. Like, what is water to a fish? It's my world. I don't know, right? Like, I can't describe water. It's like, it's just there. So, is time just the advancement of the clock? Well, maybe. It could be. But how long is a year? 365.25 days? Or 64.25 days? I can't remember if 4 or 5. But there's an extra quarter day in there. That's why we have a leap year every 4 years, to make up for that. How long is a year on Mars? That's different than Earth, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, now we got into this weird stuff. We have been measuring time by our distance to the sun, but the universe is a lot bigger than our little solar system, right? So a second, an hour, a minute, a day, they're all, it's in flux, it changes. And scientists knew this when they started to do scientific tests that like down to the microsecond mattered. They couldn't rely on the sun because like the Earth like actually moves in its orbit a little bit, and we don't experience those changes, but it happens. They actually have to add a few seconds to the clock every now and then just to like correct things because the Earth moves around and stuff. So atomic clocks, if you ever heard of those, atomic clocks don't measure time based on our distance from the sun and going around it, but based upon how electrons bounce around each other. There's a consistency to an electron in their bouncing. So an atomic clock keeps the most precise time, and those are the scientific clocks that people will use for very precise scientific measurements down to like nanoseconds, because that doesn't fluctuate as much as the sun does. So what is time? Like, time changes itself. It's weird, but time changes. Is it just like the advancement of our location? Have you ever been driving and looked at your speedometer in mph? What does that mean? Miles per hour, right? That's how many miles you're traveling. So speed is distance divided by time. So time is an element in that. Well, that's really interesting, but time is not constant, and we experience it as a constant because we're on planet Earth. So we don't really experience the changes, but if you're on a mountain and someone has an atomic clock down on the beach, the person that's actually on the beach has a different time than the person on the mountain. Because mass actually affects the flow of time. This is what is new science, according to Einstein in the 1920s. He figured this part out. Oh, speed is distance. Time slows down the farther away you are from objects of mass. So your phone, my phone's right here, but your phone has a clock on it, right? And the clock is based on satellite signals that are being sent to your phone. The satellite's farther away from Earth than you are, obviously. It's in orbit. That affects its time because time moves slower out there because it's farther away from the mass of the Earth. So they have to apply the theory of relativity to your clock on your phone to make up for the correction of how long it takes, the difference between time out there and here. So weird stuff happens. Time is not a constant thing. That we just experience it as constant, like click, click, click. If I count to 3, that's probably 3 seconds, right? But it's not really true. It's weird when you look at time. Time also slows down the closer to the speed of light you get. So if you are traveling at the speed of light, time no longer exists, and you're going to see the entire universe happen all at the same time, because time doesn't exist. This is what Einstein figured out, is that space and time are the same thing. If you're Star Trek fans, you know the space-time continuum, right? So space and time are the same thing. So Einstein started calling it space-time. And time slows down the further away you get from an object of mass, because the object of mass is warping space around it. Therefore, it's warping time around it. And the further away you get from that object, or the closer to the speed of light you get, the slower time is going to move for you. So if I were to get on a spaceship and fly at, a quarter of the speed of light out 40 years and come back 40 years, I'll experience 40 years, but y'all here are going to experience like 350 years. It's just weird like that. Science fiction fans over here. So space and time are the same thing. What happened at the Big Bang? There was a small singularity. What was outside of the singularity? Nothing. There wasn't anything. Nothing existed really except for that singularity of infinite mass that exploded. So you can make the argument that time didn't even exist then, because there was no space. So space and time were the thing. That was created at the Big Bang. That's a weird thought. Time didn't exist. What was before the Big Bang? that the word before didn't exist until the Big Bang. So you can't ask the question what happened before the Big Bang, because time didn't even exist then, because there was no space, and space and time are the same thing. Are you confused yet? Good. So am I. I had to double check my science with AI. I'm like, does this make sense, AI? And it said, yeah, that's actually how it works. I was like, okay. I thought that's how it worked in my head, but it does. So that's the science end of things. But now we got to bring in the theological end of things, right? Because we're talking about a God who that is, and the word that we want to use for this is eternal. Now we want to attach time to the word eternal, right? Time without end, no beginning and no end, kind of a thing. But we use an infinite timeline to think about the word eternity. Infinite backwards, infinite forwards. It never has an end, and then you can't find the beginning, and so it's infinite. But if you look at this Big Bang again, and you bring it down to the singularity, that's an infinite portion of mass, but in the tiniest little space. So we can actually apply the kind of science we use for the Big Bang to our concept of eternity, and not say eternity is this long line without end or beginning, but an infinite right now, infinite present moment. That's kind of a weird thought to have. But here's something that I thought. Our experience of time is an experience of the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that entropy increases as you move forward in time. Right? You got old, I got old, my vision is not as what it used to be. Some of you are missing hair. Right? That's called entropy. We call it aging, but it's actually entropy. Right? If you put an apple on your counter and walk away and come back in a week, it's probably going to look a little bit brown, right? That's entropy. We call it rotting, but it's entropy. Entropy says that things like decrease in their ability to stay a stable thing. Aging is not the experience of time, but the experience of entropy. You're not able to be young anymore. Like my legs hurt so bad today because of yesterday, being at the party and walking around and setting stuff up and moving things around. And man, my knees were screaming at me and my thighs were burning, and I was like, I gotta sit down, but I got like 3 million dishes to do. So I had to get back up and then take ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is like, I will fight entropy with ibuprofen today. Right? So that we're not experiencing time, we're experiencing the second law of thermodynamics that says you can't stay in a perfect state. So time is a dimension. Like if you look at a 3D space, and you're a 3D designer, you have X, Y, and Z coordinates, right? That's 3 dimensions, 3-dimensional space. Time is the 4th dimension that the 3-dimensional space moves through, like an arrow, kind of a thing. The physical world, it goes through that, but it's the second law of thermodynamics being applied. Entropy is happening. So we can't understand things outside of time very well because that's like trying to explain things like a fish. But if we look at eternity, eternity is not an infinite timeline that doesn't end, but an infinite now of the present moment that is here. And so the word eternal means that there is an infinite present moment now. And this is where it touches on the afterlife, because when we die, we do know that we enter eternity somehow. Don't know what that looks like or what that'll be like, but we enter the infinite now moment. And so does that mean that we enter into just a present moment, and not like we're looking back and watching the timeline unfold, but now we're experiencing the full extent of all time and all space. That's kind of eternal right there. And so, where did yesterday go? Anybody? I don't know where it went. I'm like, back there, but that's the curtain. You know, it's not behind the curtain. Where's tomorrow being stored, right? Where's it going to come from? Where's it going? Where's it come from? What the Celtic Christians understood is that the eternal is a present now moment. And almost like all of the present nows flow from eternity and back into eternity, like this wheel that happens. And a lot of early cultures believed that time was cyclical, not timeline. And so we have the seasons, the 4 seasons, and they had the seasons that they experienced, and they saw time as cyclical. Now, if you look at like a wheel on a car, time is cyclical, right? Your wheel is cyclical, but you're also going somewhere. And so I think that's more of what we're talking about when time. So God is eternal, has always been eternal, has always been present, but time didn't always exist. God does not exist inside of time, because time is the physical space that we inhabit, and God is infinite and eternal and outside of that. And so what happened before the Big Bang, I don't really know. But there's always been an eternal now, and there's always been the present moment that is eternal, that all time flows into the eternity and flows out. So when you start saying what happened before that, it's like, I don't know. That's a weird question to ask someone who lives inside of time and experiences it like a fish experiences water. So God did exist before the Big Bang, but not in a time sense, because God is the infinite now, the present moment. And God can't fit inside of time, but time fits inside of God, kind of a thing. And so this infinite moment has been there. So you can actually believe in the Big Bang and science and all that and God and have this conversation with faith. And there's ancient theologies that are really fun to play with, like the Celtic theology of eternity is a whole lot of fun. So in the eternal world, all is one. This is a Celtic understanding. In spiritual space, there is no distance. In eternal time, there is no segmentation into today, yesterday, or tomorrow. In eternal time, all is now. Time is presence. I believe this is what eternal life means. It is a life where all that we seek, goodness, unity, beauty, truth, and love, are no longer distant from us, but are now completely present with us. And this is what Jesus offers us. Eternal life is not a promise that you'll go to heaven when you die, but a promise that you'll experience the life of heaven in the present. And when you do die, then you're like, well, this is just a continuation of what I've been experiencing. It's just like the fulfillment of what I've been experiencing. And so eternal life has something to do with the afterlife, but not entirely to do with the afterlife. Eternal life is the experiencing of God's eternal present now in this moment. Which brings us to the second question. If we have an all-forgiving God, why is hell a thought? If he forgives us for all sins, wouldn't he forgive those who don't believe in him? Well, isn't that an interesting question? Because this is the worldview of Old Testament people. That's what they thought the world was. Our world is a little bit different now that we've got some cosmology that's added to it, right? So they believed that there was floodgates at the top. There was a ceiling, and there was water above the ceiling. Water's in the firmament up there. And if you look at the wording of the Noah's Ark, that's when the floodgates opened. The whole concept of opening the floodgates, they thought it was a part of the physical universe, and let out all of the waters from above down to the earth and flooded everything. That's because they've had this understanding of the world. The ocean had no end to it. It was a constant abyss. The mountains were kind of the pillars that held up the world. But down in the center is this place called Sheol. Now, what the Sheol is that? That's fun. Sheol. Sheol is the early Jewish afterlife theology. It had a singular destination for all people who died. There was no division. Everybody who died went into this dark abyss pit thing called Sheol. And it's not a place of punishment and rewards. It's just a dark cavern that all the dead went to. That was it. And if you think about what we do with people who have passed on, traditionally we place them in the ground, right? And so they naturally thought downwards is the place of Sheol. And rain comes from above, which waters your crops. So the divine must be up there. And there was this separation that happened in early thought. But I think most of us have been on a plane. We've been up there. We saw there was no firmament and floodgates and all that kind of stuff. So this Sheol place was not a place of punishment or rewards. It was just the dark cavern that all the dead went to, and there was no fire, no devil, no demons, nothing that we get in a modern day context. Death was just kind of viewed as the enemy of life. And so there was a shift that happened halfway through the Old Testament when Babylon came down and destroyed the whole Jerusalem in place and took them into captivity. They started to ask existential questions like, what kind of God would allow this? Why did God, and what does God do with people who do things like this? Because it was a very brutal, if you look at how like Babylonians or Ninevites captured cities. It was not pretty. I'm not going to name them here because it turns my stomach, but it was a very brutal thing. So people left who were survivors looking out at it. Were just like, what? They're looking out at carnage and they're saying, what kind of God allows this? This is horrible. So they had a theological shift and they said, who's going to rescue us from this place that we're in, this pit that we're in? It's like we're experiencing Sheol, but in the present, because we're in exile and we want to have access to our families and our land and our temple it was this whole thing. So then they came up with this theology called the bodily resurrection. The bodily resurrection became a thing halfway through the Old Testament because they wanted justice for themselves, and they wanted to know that at the end of all time, God was going to set things right, because what they were experiencing was not right. It was not okay. And so they came up with a theology called the bodily resurrection that says God will, at the end of all times, resurrect the righteous. And you can see this starting to take root in like the books of Daniel and stuff. But the righteous will be resurrected out of Sheol at the end of all time. So they started to pray for the dead during the Maccabean period in the 200s. So that would be after the last book of the Old Testament is written, before the gospel accounts. They started a practice where they would pray for the dead martyrs because they were at war with, I think it was the Greeks at the time. They're trying to gain their independence. And they were heavily martyred, killed, persecuted. And so they started to pray for the dead and ask for God's justice to be brought for those who had died. So the whole doctrine of purgatory comes out of that book of the Apocrypha, the Apocryphas of the Maccabean times. Because they said God would not just let us die without justice. That's not the God we believe in. Our God will bring justice somehow. So then we have the New Testament and Christ, and there's a specific thing that happens with Christ. He resurrects from the dead. This is not a new theology for them. They expect that God is going to resurrect the righteous. But here, they experience it, they think it's going to be at the end of all time. And so Jesus resurrecting from the dead in the present moment took everybody by surprise, except for a few women who were actually listening to what Jesus said. But it took everyone else by surprise. They're like, wait, I thought that was the thing that happens later. So when the disciples are hearing Jesus talk about the resurrection of the dead, they're like, well, yeah, we all believe that. But that happens later. So I guess we're going to, we lose if you die, because the resurrection is not going to happen for a long time. And Jesus resurrects not at the end of time, but right in their present moment. And it totally took their theology and turned it on its head. But the theology then that started to be crafted was that Jesus defeated death, the enemy of life. He defeated death and turned it into a gateway to experience more life. And so the early martyrs of the church were lining up to Colosseums like, hey, take me out, that'll be fun. And they would let lions tear them apart, be burned at the stake. That whole first 200 years of martyrdom in the church, they were all the death is just a gateway to life. We're cool. Go ahead, take us out, we're fine. Jesus has defeated death. And so that theology of resurrection fueled the early martyr movements. But then, as the church started to not be persecuted anymore, they were adopted by the Roman government in 387, I believe it was, or 86. They weren't persecuted anymore. They're like, okay, so now what do? We're not being persecuted. We can just do whatever we wanted to because we're part of the government. So they had 4 schools of thought develop about what actually happens to the righteous and the unrighteous. Because if there's a resurrection for the righteous, then they're like, what happens to the unrighteous? And so 4 schools of thought started to come out of the resurrection of Jesus idea. And the 4 classic ones were eternal conscious torment. That's the fun one. That's the one that's kind of prominent in most American evangelical theology that says if you die unrighteous, you go to a place of suffering for eternity. And the way that they describe it, you don't want to go there. But that's not the only one. That's the prominent American evangelical one, and probably Catholic as well. But there's also annihilation. You like the bomb? The annihilation says that if you die and you're a part of the unrighteous, then your soul just ceases to exist. Just like I don't remember what it was like during Abraham Lincoln's time, because I didn't exist, right? So they're to say annihilation. Your soul is destroyed. It doesn't exist anymore. Then there is a purgatorial view of things that says you die and you go to like the eternal waiting room, and you gotta be kind of purged of all of your sins until you can enter. Unless it was, there's different views of this one. There's different ways to believe this one. Like Catholics believe there's mortal sins and venial sins. If you commit a mortal sin, you don't go to purgatory. You're just going straight to the ECT place. But if they're just kind of venial sins, you're like, it's okay, you know. You'll go to purgatory until all your loved ones pray you out of there. So that's a Catholic view of purgatory. But there's also like an Anglican view that says nobody's equipped to just enter into the presence of pure love, because Lord have mercy, like we're used to hiding things and manipulating people, and like we don't just love and be fully authentic with everybody. That'd be like walking out in the street naked. It's just like, we don't do that, right? Like, you can't bare your psychological soul to the entire world. So we're used to covering up who we are with, like, with a presentation. This is kind of who I present to the world, kind of a thing, like wearing psychological clothes. With purgatory, you don't get to do that. You just stand before God, who fully sees you, but it's the presence of love. And sometimes, like, addicts know this best, I think. When you get called out, and then it's like the intervention happens, and that feels like a burning, like you have to wake up to who you are and how you've actually been in life, then the purgatory is like, feels like that. Because now you're in the presence of somebody who sees you, and you can't trick them, and they perfectly love you, and they will call you out on everything, and not show you, like, they're just gonna, this is how it is, and I love it. But you're not prepared for that right away, so you have to kind of work your way into heaven. C.S. Lewis believed this version. If you read his Great Divorce series. So there's that one, and then the final one is universalism. That says, it kind of brings in that purgatorial view that says that everybody will get there eventually, and some people are going to take a long time because they got a lot of things to make up for. Because if you have the universalism, the number one question you will get is, well, what about Hitler? It's like, oh, he's got a lot of stuff to do when he gets there. So that's the kind of the thing. So those are the four different things. The one that was believed the most by the early church was universalism. There was 6 schools of thought, and there was only one that was eternal conscious torment, one that was annihilation, and then 4 were actually a blend of purgatory universalism. So that's what we think happens when you die, but it's all philosophical at this point. We don't really know, but I trust that God is love, and when I die, I'm going to enter into the presence of that love, and I'm trying to best prepare myself in the present. So some people will say universalism isn't very good because how you live in this present life doesn't matter, because everyone's going to go to heaven anyway, so what does it matter if you're religious or moral or ethical? It's like, well, it matters a lot because it affects how long it's going to take you to get into that presence and what your purgatorial experience will be. So there's a lot of different ways to think about this question, what happens when we die? Probably globally in the historical church, the one that's believed the least would be annihilation, but John Stott, a very American evangelical pastor, believed that one. Modern day, eternal conscious torment is going to be the one that is believed the most, but there are a lot of newer thoughts coming out that are re-embracing the older original universalism, purgatorial understandings of what happens when you die. So, if we have an all-loving, all-forgiving God, couldn't somebody, why is hell even a thought, kind of a thing? The original concept for why hell was a thought was we need to experience justice. So the people who were being burned at the stake were experiencing injustice, and they say, well, you're burning me now, but my time of justice will be later. And so that thought came out of that desire for justice, because I'm being persecuted in unimaginable ways, but the persecutors will experience justice one day. I think at the core of it all, we just want to know that God's going to make things right, don't we? And I trust that God can make things right without sending a bunch of people to burn eternally. That's my personal view. Some might believe differently, and that's fine. But I don't think that anyone needs to be burned in a lake of fire for eternity for God to receive any glory. That's my personal view. I think more of the other end of the spectrum, that we're all going to get there one day. It might be harder for some of us than others. And it's very important how we live in the present day, because when we enter into a presence of pure love, boy, that can, like if you're a racist person and you got to sit next to the person you're racist against at the table in heaven, you're going to be like, why is that person here? Like, you got a lot of work to do, right? Like, this is a thing for all tribes, nations, and tongues, all tribes, nations, and tongues kind of a thing. So heaven can be a burning, because when you get there, you got a lot of work to do. Like, I have to purge my soul of all of the crap that I've accumulated throughout my entire life, whether it be trauma or different hatreds or different things that we've accumulated over the years. Everyone's going to have their own junk and baggage when we get there. So if you could deal with all that junk and baggage in the present day, I think it's going to make things a little bit smoother. That's what I think sainthood is just like when you die, you're just like, oh yeah, I've been experiencing this already. So that's kind of a thought there. We're running low on time, so we got to do this one. God's will versus free will. Is our life planned out by God, or do things happen from humans' free will? Yes. Sorry, that's the short answer. Do people come into our life because of God? Yes. But there's two different ways to look at this. There's sovereignty and there's providence. And these are the two different schools of thought within Christianity. Sovereignty says that God is supreme, unlimited reign over all creation and gets to control past, present, future, all that kind of stuff. We understand that when we say God's omnipotent, can do anything, but can God make a rock big enough to where he can't lift it? Then we get into problems, right? Like, well, God can't do that. Can God sin? No, God can't do that. So is God all-powerful? Well, with a lot of qualifiers, I guess you could say that, but there's a lot of qualifiers. God can't sin, God can't cease to exist, there's a lot of things God can't do. So then it's like, well, that term omnipotent doesn't really make any sense at that point. But providence is different. Providence is like God is active, has ongoing involvement in our lives, but doesn't get to control the outcomes. Because love doesn't control, right? If you've ever experienced some manipulative force controlling you, it's like, well, that's not love. So if God is love, I don't think God can manipulate outcomes. But providence is something. God will bring you opportunity and have you honed yourself for that opportunity. Have you prepared yourself to seize that opportunity to its fullest extent? That's a good question there. That's providence, where God has ordained certain things to come into your path, and then what you do with them are yours. How you handle them are yours. How you prepared yourself to then have them are yours. But God does not orchestrate as like a kind of a puppet does, but more of aligns certain things to be along your path, so that it's like the term serendipity, right? Like, I cannot believe it just so happened that, right? But you had a choice in the moment of what you're going to do with the serendipity. That's providence. So God aligns good things for us to do and good things for us to happen to us. But then the bad things that happen to us in life are not God saying, well, now it's time for cancer. Like, that's not how it works. God aligns the good things to happen, and then it's our idea to kind of travel through them. So then the other part of it, do bad things happen from human free will? Yes, because that's the thing. But how can an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God allow sin in the world? Well, it depends on how we view God. If God is like this ultimate puppet master pulling on all the strings and saying, okay, now it's time for you to suffer, now it's time for you to have a blessing, now it's time. That's not really how providence works. Providence is God aligns good things to happen, and then we have a responsibility to meet them. But then the bad things in life happen because we're in a world that's broken and fallen, and God does not, I don't think God is this omnipotent force that has all power because of all those qualifiers. Once we say, well, then can God do this and can God do that? Can God heat up a burrito so hot that even he can't eat it? Like, there's lots of questions that we have in this moment. And so the word omnipotent, it comes from an Old Testament word that doesn't mean all power. It just means supremely powerful. And then it was then translated later on as like God has lots of power. I think God is the most powerful being in the universe, but that love does not control, because love doesn't control. Love gives us the choice. And so bad things happen to us not because God is like, all right, now it's time for tragedy, but more of this world, tragedies happen in this world. And God will meet you in the tragedy and walk with you through them. But God is not there to prevent things from happening. And like, if you've experienced tragedy, you know this, because then you have the existential questions, like what kind of God allows this to happen? God doesn't allow that to happen. Bad things happen in the world. Period goes at the end of that statement. Bad things happen in this world. Period. And a good God will meet you in it, walk with you through it, and provide good opportunities on the horizon. There's lots of different questions that we can then take that. And we don't have the time to explore all of them. But I hope that gives a little bit of light on some of those deep questions. So, does that sound good? All right, we have completed the question series, I think. I don't know what's next, because I've been trying to get to this and the open house. And so I don't know what this week looks like. We're going to see. So let's have our benediction and our Lord's Prayer, and we'll call it a day. This is Psalm 52, retold by Malcolm Guite. And it says this: He calls you to discern his time and season. The eternal season of his mercy lifts like the sun above your dark horizon. Expose your darkness, sing your misery. His light will judge, and judging, heal your sin. Then bathe in sheer beauty as Allegri sounds out your penitence, and let Christ clean your soul once more, erasing every stain, washing you thoroughly, for he has seen what you confess and what you hide. Again, he mends your broken bones and makes for you a clean heart. Comes to comfort you again, comes with his Holy Spirit to renew the spirit in you, calling you to sing of all your loving God has done for you. And that is Psalm